Welcome back. Last time we were looking at how peace agreements are drafted and all the negotiations and stuff. Today we're diving into the final chapter of Dr. Paul Williams' book, Lawyering Peace. And this chapter is about post-conflict governance. So we're going to be looking at all of the challenges involved in rebuilding a nation's legal and political systems.
You know, it's kind of like you're trying to put a puzzle together and the pieces are still smoldering.
Yeah, it's not just about, silencing the guns. It's about preventing them from firing again. So that's a huge challenge. How do we even begin with such a monumental task?
Yeah. I think one of the first dilemmas that negotiators face is whether to try and hammer out a whole new constitution as part of the peace process or to kind of leave that for later. And there's pros and cons to both approaches, as you can imagine. And there are some really, vivid examples of this from real-world peace processes. So, one example is the Dayton Accords, which ended the war in Bosnia. They decided to include a full constitution. And that was really aimed at kind of, bringing a swift resolution to the conflict. But one of the consequences of that was that it actually kind of locked in some of the ethnic divisions that had fueled the conflict in the first place.
It almost, it created a system that was functional on paper, but it didn't really have that deeper legitimacy, that you get from a more organic process.
Yeah, and, contrast that with the case of South Africa. They opted for what's called an interim constitution, just kind of set out some guiding principles, and that allowed for a more inclusive and evolving process to take place.
It seems like there's no, magic formula.
Right.
It's really about weighing the context, the urgency of the situation.
Yeah.
And then thinking about the long-term consequences of your decisions.
Exactly. And that kind of leads us to another crucial factor, I think, in this whole process, which is the question of timing. How long should these processes take? If you move too fast, you risk excluding voices. You end up making hasty decisions that you might regret later. But if you drag it out too long, then you risk losing momentum and leaving the door open for spoilers to come in and kind of, derail the process.
It's a delicate balance.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes me think of the Good Friday Agreement in Northern Ireland.
Yeah.
They invested years in this process of preparation and negotiation, gradually bringing more and more groups into the fold.
Right.
And that ultimately, I think, fostered a lot of trust and led to a more sustainable outcome.
It's a real testament to the power of patience and inclusion.
Yeah.
But, contrast that with a case like Yemen, where they had a very kind of rushed timeline. They were really hoping to kind of get things done quickly. But it ended up being undermined by economic turmoil, political maneuvering, and ultimately the process kind of collapsed and the country slid back into conflict.
It seems like there's a sweet spot. And it really depends on the context.
Yeah. Every conflict is different. Every context has its own unique set of challenges and dynamics.
So how do peacemakers even begin to navigate this? I mean, what are the tools that they have at their disposal?
Well, one tool that's become increasingly popular in recent years is the use of what's called interim constitutions. You can kind of think of them as a bridge between that immediate need for stability after a conflict and the longer-term goal of establishing a more robust system of governance. So they allow for kind of initial compromises. They buy time to build trust and build institutions. And crucially, they can be adjusted as needed. And we've seen this play out in places like Somalia, for example, where they used what's called a thin interim charter to kind of address those really urgent needs. And then later on, they transitioned to a more detailed permanent constitution.
Okay, so it gives them some breathing room.
Yeah.
But are interim constitutions always the answer?
They're not a silver bullet.
Okay.
They have to be carefully designed, and you have to make sure that there are safeguards against abuse.
Right.
And that there's a clear path towards a more robust system down the road. If you look at a case like South Sudan, they adopted a very weak interim constitution. It didn't really have many checks and balances on power. And that actually ended up delaying genuine reform and contributed to further instability.
So it's not just about having an interim constitution, it's about the details.
Exactly. It's got to be well crafted. And it's got to strike that balance between addressing the immediate needs and laying the groundwork for a more sustainable future.
So we've talked about whether to draft a constitution during peace negotiations. We've talked about the importance of timing. We've talked about interim constitutions. What are some of the other big questions that negotiators have to grapple with when it comes to post-conflict governance?
Well, I think one of the most fundamental questions is how deep those reforms should go. Should you simply amend an existing constitution? Or should you just scrap it all together and start fresh with a brand new one?
I mean, that's a huge decision, isn't it?
It is. And, often this reflects the underlying power dynamic. Those groups who benefited from the old system,
Hmm.
they're often going to push for very limited amendments.
They want to hold on to their power.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Whereas, those who are seeking change are going to be pushing for a fresh start. If you look at the case of Macedonia, for example, they were able to make some very targeted amendments to their constitution
Right.
that successfully addressed specific conflict drivers.
Interesting.
So it was a very kind of strategic approach, focused on making a few key changes, and it actually proved to be quite effective.
So that's one way to go about it. But are there times when you really need to just, start from scratch?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes a fresh start is really necessary.
Yeah.
If you look at a case like Guatemala, for example, they had this incredibly ambitious amendment process. There was something like 50 proposed changes.
Wow.
I mean, it just became so complex
Yeah.
that it was ultimately hijacked by opponents of reform.
Yeah, 50? That's a lot to juggle.
It really highlights the need for clarity and focus
Yeah.
when you're designing constitutions. Trying to do too much at once can really backfire, especially in a context where there's so much uncertainty and mistrust already.
So about the quality of the changes, not just the quantity.
Exactly. And then, on the other end of the spectrum, you have cases like Syria, where the question of whether to amend or draft a new constitution became a major sticking point in the peace talks. The regime insisted on just making some amendments, whereas the opposition demanded a whole new constitution.
So these are not just like abstract legal debates. These are about real power struggles.
Exactly, competing visions for the future. And it really underscores the importance of finding a process that's perceived as legitimate and inclusive by all sides.
Even with a well-crafted constitution,
Yeah.
how do you make sure that the people actually support it?
Right. Well, that's where referendums come in. The idea of putting the Constitution to a vote and letting the people decide sounds great in theory.
Right. It gives the people a voice.
Yeah. But in practice, they can be pretty tricky, especially in these post-conflict settings where public opinion is very volatile
Mm-hmm.
and, can be easily manipulated.
Yeah, we've seen examples where referendums have worked out well.
Yeah.
But we've also seen them backfire spectacularly.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mhm.
I mean, in Northern Ireland, they had a very well-run referendum on the Good Friday Agreement.
Mm-hmm.
And that really reinforced the peace process. But then in Iraq, they had a referendum that was designed to ensure minority input. But it ended up actually deepening sectarian divisions.
Oh, wow.
And in Colombia, they had a referendum on the peace deal.
Right.
But it was framed in a way that focused on the most controversial elements of the deal.
Interesting.
And so even though there was broad support for the peace process overall, the referendum ended up being rejected.
So referendums are a gamble,
Yeah, they're a high-stakes gamble.
and they can go either way.
Exactly. And the outcome really depends on a lot of factors. How the question's framed, the level of public education, the broader political context.
So we've been talking about all these challenges of building new constitutions in these fragile post-conflict environments. But I'm curious, how does the peace agreement itself relate to this new constitution? Like which one takes precedence? How do you ensure that they kind of work together smoothly?
Yeah, that's a really key question. And it's something that negotiators need to think about very carefully right from the get-go. If you don't clearly define the relationship between these two documents, you can end up with a lot of legal ambiguities and political disputes down the line. And that can really undermine the whole peace process.
So what are some of the options for kind of managing that relationship?
Well, one approach is to be very explicit in the peace agreement itself and actually state which document is going to have supremacy. So, for example, in Sudan, they specified that the peace agreement would actually override any subsequent constitutional decrees.
Interesting.
So that was a way to kind of safeguard the gains that had been made during the peace process and ensure that the transition to a new system of governance wouldn't undermine those agreements.
Yeah, it's like building in a safety net.
Exactly, to prevent backsliding.
Right.
And it highlights the fact that these are not just, theoretical legal questions. These have very real political implications. Another option is to actually incorporate key elements of the peace agreement directly into the new constitution. So that can be a way to ensure continuity and to prevent future governments from just kind of ignoring or reinterpreting the terms of the agreement.
You're kind of embedding the spirit of that peace process.
Exactly, into the very fabric of the new legal order.
Yeah.
But there are also, potential downsides to this approach. If you make the Constitution too rigid, it can be very difficult to adapt to changing circumstances
Yeah.
or to address new challenges that might arise down the line.
So peace negotiators have to be strategic,
Yeah,
and they have to be adaptable. They
absolutely.
have to think about not just the immediate needs, but also the long-term implications of the decisions that they're making.
Exactly. They have to anticipate those potential challenges, weigh the trade-offs, and come up with a solution that's both principled and pragmatic.
It sounds like post-conflict governance is just full of these really complex and challenging dilemmas.
It is.
But it also sounds like there are valuable lessons to be learned from those who have managed to navigate these challenges successfully.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a growing body of knowledge and experience in this field, and I think peacemakers can really draw on that to inform their decisions and increase the chances of success.
So it's not about reinventing the wheel every time. It's about learning from the past, adapting those lessons to new contexts, and just constantly refining our approaches.
Exactly. And that brings us to another crucial aspect of post-conflict governance, I think, which is the role of human rights.
Okay.
Violations of human rights are often at the root of many conflicts. So addressing those injustices and creating a system that protects fundamental freedoms is really essential for building lasting peace.
Yeah, I mean, it's about creating a society
Yeah.
where everyone feels safe and respected and empowered to participate in the political process.
Yeah.
But how do you translate those lofty ideals into concrete legal and political realities? What are the specific dilemmas that negotiators face when they're trying to integrate human rights into this whole process of post-conflict governance?
Well, I think one of the biggest challenges is figuring out how to incorporate those rights into the new legal framework. Do you actually spell out specific rights within the Constitution itself? Or do you rely on existing international treaties?
So this is a question of how explicit do you want to be?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there are, pros and cons to each approach. Enumerating specific rights in the Constitution can be a really powerful way to protect those rights and to hold the government accountable, because it sends a clear signal to citizens that these rights aren't just abstract concepts. They're actually enshrined in the highest law of the land.
But I imagine there are also downsides to that.
Yeah, there are. Being too explicit can sometimes create conflict, particularly if there's disagreement about the scope or interpretation of those rights. So in some contexts, it might be more strategic to take a more general approach and to rely on existing international treaties.
So it's about finding that balance
Yeah.
between clarity
Yeah.
and flexibility, between making a strong statement and avoiding unnecessary controversy.
Exactly. And again, there's no one-size-fits-all answer here.
And even once you've decided how to incorporate those rights, there's still the question of which rights to prioritize. Do you focus on those kind of fundamental rights? That right to life, freedom from torture, freedom of speech, freedom of religion? Or do you take a more expansive approach and include things like socioeconomic rights, the right to education, healthcare, a decent standard of living?
That's a really crucial question, and it gets to the heart of what we mean by a just and equitable society. Some people argue that those fundamental rights are the starting point, that they're the bare minimum that any decent society should guarantee. But others argue that true equality requires more than just the absence of oppression. It also requires the positive ability to live a life of dignity and fulfillment. And that means including those socioeconomic rights as well.
Yeah, so it's a debate about the role of government and the relationship between individual rights and collective responsibilities.
Exactly. We can see how this debate has played out in different peace processes. The Rambouillet Accords, for example, which were the peace talks that tried to end the conflict in Kosovo, they really prioritized those fundamental rights, particularly the ones that are enshrined in the European Convention on Human Rights.
Okay.
And that made sense in the context of that conflict, because there had been widespread human rights abuses, ethnic cleansing, torture, all sorts of terrible things.
The focus was on protecting those core civil and political liberties.
Exactly, which were seen as the most urgent priority at that time.
Yeah.
But that approach also meant that socioeconomic rights were largely left out of the picture.
Okay.
On the other hand, if you look at South Africa, they took a much more expansive approach in their 1996 constitution. Their Bill of Rights includes not just those core freedoms, but also a whole range of socioeconomic rights, like the right to education, healthcare, housing, you name it.
Oh, that's ambitious.
It is. It's a very ambitious approach, but I think it reflects a deeper understanding of the interconnectedness of human rights.
Yeah, I mean, you can't really enjoy freedom of speech if you're starving.
Exactly. And, South Africa's experience shows that it is possible to incorporate those socioeconomic rights into a post-conflict constitution. But it also highlights the challenges of implementation. They've made significant progress, but they still face a lot of persistent inequalities.
So it's a reminder that constitutions are just a starting point.
Yeah, they're a framework,
Right.
but it's up to governments and citizens to actually bring those rights to life.
Right. You need action.
Exactly. And that brings us to another layer of complexity, I think, which is the challenge of balancing international human rights norms with local cultural and religious contexts.
So what might be considered a fundamental right in one society might be viewed quite differently in another. And finding that balance between universal principles and local particularities can be incredibly tricky.
Yeah, it's like walking a tightrope. You want to uphold those universal values, but you also want to respect the diversity of human experience and avoid imposing solutions that don't resonate with the people they're meant to serve.
Yeah, it's a constant push and pull, isn't it?
It is.
Trying to find that path that respects both those universal principles, but also the unique cultural landscape of each society.
Exactly. And the chapter highlights some really interesting cases where peace agreements have tried to kind of navigate this delicate balance. One example is Yemen's 2015 draft constitution,
Okay.
which guaranteed human rights as long as they do not conflict with Sharia. It's a very specific and somewhat ambiguous formulation that raises all sorts of questions about interpretation and implementation.
Yeah. It sounds like that kind of language could easily be used to restrict rights
Right.
in the name of religion.
That's a valid concern. And unfortunately, the draft constitution was never actually implemented because
Right.
the conflict in Yemen reignited. So we don't really have a clear answer to those questions. But it does highlight the need for really careful thought and nuanced legal drafting when you're dealing with these really sensitive issues.
Yeah, you have to be so careful with the language.
You do.
Because the words really matter.
They do.
It's about finding a way to reconcile those potentially conflicting values without, undermining the core principles of human rights.
Absolutely. And I think it underscores the importance of dialogue and engagement, between different communities, different legal traditions, different ways of understanding human rights. It's not about imposing a one-size-fits-all solution. It's about finding a path that resonates with the lived experiences and values of the people.
So it's not just a legal exercise, it's also a social and cultural one.
Absolutely. Another interesting case that kind of illustrates these complexities is Somalia.
Okay.
Their 2004 interim constitution recognized international human rights treaties, but it also declared Islam as the state religion, with Sharia as a source of legislation. So it's an interesting juxtaposition. And it's led to some real challenges in practice, with ongoing pressure from Islamist groups who want to see a much stricter interpretation of Sharia.
It sounds like a constant balancing act.
It is.
Trying to reconcile those different perspectives and find a way to move forward that respects both the universality of human rights, but also the particularities of that specific context.
Yeah, and I think it highlights the fact that constitutions are not static documents. They're living frameworks that evolve over time as societies grapple with these really complex issues, and that evolution often involves debate, compromise, and sometimes even, creative legal interpretation.
And even with the best of intentions and the most carefully crafted language, there's no guarantee that human rights will be fully realized.
Right.
It requires constant effort, vigilance, and a commitment to holding those in power accountable.
Oh, well said. And I think that brings us back to a key theme that runs throughout this chapter, which is that constitutions are not magic wands. They're tools, and their effectiveness depends on a whole range of factors. The commitment of political leaders, the strength of civil society, the willingness of citizens to hold their government accountable. And that's a process that takes time, it takes effort, and it takes a deep understanding of the complexities of human nature and the legacies of conflict. It's about recognizing that peace building is not just about ending the violence, it's about addressing the root causes of that violence and creating a society where everyone can live with dignity and hope.
It's a powerful message, and one that I think resonates really deeply with me. As we come to the end of our exploration of this final chapter of Lawyering Peace, we've covered so much ground in this deep dive. From the initial decision of whether to even draft a new constitution, to the challenges of timing, sequencing, balancing all these different interests. We've talked about the complexities of human rights, the role of referendums, and the importance of creating a system that's both principled and pragmatic.
We've seen how these decisions are not just technical or legal matters. They're deeply intertwined with politics, power dynamics, and the aspirations of the people who are involved. It's a reminder that peace building is a holistic endeavor. It requires not just legal expertise, but also a deep understanding of the human dimension of conflict and a commitment to creating a more just and equitable world.
So on that note, I think we'll wrap up. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time.